Great. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar on child identity theft. And our presenter today is Dr. Axton Betz-Hamilton from South Dakota State University. And I'm going to turn it over to her. Axton.
All right. Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to all who are joining today. Real quickly, our webinar producer is Rose. She and Sarah are monitoring the chat. So if you have any tech issues, feel free to put them in the chat and Rose will help you with that. If you want or need captions, if you go to the toolbar in the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see the closed captioning tool there. If you don't see it, click the three dots where it says more, and you should be able to find it. If you struggle with that, again, send a message to Rose in the chat, and she'll be able to help you. And then a little bit more about myself. So I'm an assistant professor and undergraduate program coordinator of consumer affairs at South Dakota State University. And a lot of folks wonder, what is consumer affairs? And that is our language for financial counseling and planning. Um, my research focus is financial abuse within families. And I feel like that's the umbrella description of my research. Um, Under that umbrella, I focus on financial exploitation of older adults by family members and also familial identity theft, which is when an individual steals the identity of one of their relatives. And as you'll see in this presentation, a lot of child identity theft actually is familial identity theft. And my interest in uh, focusing my research on financial abuse within families is due to personal experience. So I personally experienced familial identity theft, and I had a family member also experience financial exploitation. And well, it was my step grandfather, and the individual responsible for stealing my identity also engaged in financial exploitation of him. So, again, if you have any uh, questions, stories, concerns about child identity theft that you want to make sure get addressed, please at any time put them in the chat. Any questions that come up, Sarah and Rose are monitoring the chat and they'll stop me and we'll make sure that your question gets answered. So, my first item on the agenda, I guess, if you want to think of it as that, is a poll. And Rose, I'll have you do your magic with the poll. And we should have a screen that just popped up. And just a quick question: why are you participating in today's webinar? So, either for personal use, for professional use, or for both personal and professional use. Okay, so I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, so most folks here are here for personal use, and some may be here for professional use as well, but your interests are personal in nature. So some of you may be victims of child identity theft. Maybe you're a young adult and you've just recently realized it, or you know someone in your family who is engaged in child identity theft. So that helps me understand why the chat has been more quiet than in some of the other webinars I participated in. So again, no pressure to provide information in the chat. But again, if there's a question that you would like to have answered during this webinar, feel free to put it in the chat. If you want to email me afterwards, because it is sensitive in nature, you're welcome to do that as well. So in this presentation, I will share some child identity theft statistics, and I'll also share why the statistics we have really aren't that reliable. I'll then talk about stories of child identity theft, both based on my research. So I do a lot of qualitative research in the area of child identity theft and familial identity theft. I'll also include information about my own story. And then um, I'll talk about what we can learn from these stories and then talk a bit about how to repair the damage. So, oftentimes I get asked, well, how much of a problem is child identity theft? And, I'll hear from folks and they'll say, well, child identity theft can't be that much of a problem. You can't get a credit card when you're under the age of 18. And well, and even if it is a problem, you just call the credit card company and they cancel the card. It is actually a much bigger problem than that. In 2021, it was estimated that 1 in 50 children were identity theft victims, so roughly 2%. In 2019, it was estimated that 25% of children will be identity theft victims before turning age 18. Um, and 30% of identity theft perpetrators steal the identity of a family member. So, identity theft perpetrated by family members, while we don't often think of that, it's actually pretty common. And it's unfortunate that there hasn't been more attention given to this in the media and in popular press, because often the stories you see about identity theft are, often lead with an image of, a person, kind of hunched over a keyboard, wearing a hoodie and dark glasses, and, it's a hacker. A lot of identity theft does not occur that way. And, oftentimes, particularly with children, it's perpetrated by someone they know. Um, Now, I give you these prevalence statistics and estimates um, just to say they're probably not accurate because child identity theft is often underreported. So prevalence data are difficult to obtain. And it may be underreported because, again, if it's a child who's a victim, they may not know that they've been victimized until they turn 18 or 19 and they go off to college and try and get that first student loan or they try and get that first apartment. And they find out they can't because their credit report has all of these fraudulent entries and their credit score has been really damaged. So they don't know to report. And I'll get into my story in a little bit, but my identity was stolen when I was 11, and I didn't know it until I was 19. My case should have been reported when I was 11, but it wasn't. It wasn't reported until I was 19. Um, so, children don't often know. They don't if they do know, they don't necessarily have the means to report to law enforcement. They may be afraid to report, if even if they do know about it, because they're afraid of, what might happen in the family. They don't want to get someone in their family in trouble. And with that, I say someone in their family, actually parents are the number one perpetrators of child identity theft. So again, a lot of child identity theft is also familial identity theft because it's oftentimes a family member stealing a child's identity. So moving on to stories of child identity theft. So this, I want to lead off with my case. So my case has been the focus of a book that I wrote and published back in 2019 called The Less People Know About Us, a mystery of betrayal, family secrets, and stolen identity. So this book walks through my experience with identity theft and the process I went through to recover from identity theft, how that shaped my career focus, and then how my career actually helped me identify the perpetrator 20 years after my identity was stolen. Um, it also includes some intergenerational family dynamics and other things that actually led up to, I think, the identity theft. So my identity theft case spanned, again, 20 years from 1993 to 2013. So my identity was actually stolen before identity theft was considered a crime against consumers. So identity theft was not considered a crime against consumers until 1998 with the enactment of the Identity Theft and Assumption Deterrence Act. Prior to the Identity Theft and Assumption Deterrence Act, the banks and financial institutions who were defrauded by identity thieves were considered the victims. The consumer was not considered a victim at all, and no resources were provided to consumers to help them recover from identity theft. They just weren't recognized as identity theft victims until 1998. Um, in 1993, I was told that my parents' identities had been stolen, and I watched my parents deal with that unsuccessfully. So mom was the one who said that her identity and dad's identity had been stolen. And again, this was before consumers were considered victims of identity theft. And so they didn't have a lot of success in recovering from identity theft. And back at that time, nobody knew that children's identities could be stolen. In fact, really, nobody really knew what identity theft was back in the early and mid 90s. And, it wasn't the household word that it is today. So nobody bothered to check my credit report. Nobody even thought that there was a need to do that. And I went off to college in 2000 and spent my first year in the dorms. And like many young college students, they find out that dorm life is really not for them. And I moved off campus as a sophomore and found an apartment that would allow me to have two cats. So I thought life is good. I'm getting my cats, I'm getting my own space. And I called the electric company to establish service. And they told me the day and time that um, service would be switched over into my name. And I thought, okay, life is good. We're getting closer to moving into this apartment. And a few days later, my optimism, was really negatively affected when I received a letter from the electric company that said, due to your credit score, we are requiring a $100 security deposit to establish service. And I thought at the time, again, I was 19 years old, I thought it was because I didn't have enough credit. And I knew enough about credit at that time to know that not having credit can be just as damaging when you're trying to establish yourself financially as having poor credit. Okay, no big deal. So there was a letter to call, or a number to call at the bottom of the letter for a free copy of my credit report. And I called it out of curiosity because I didn't know what a credit report was when I was 19. And I wanted to know what this credit reporting agency, I didn't even know what a credit reporting agency was. I wanted to know what I thought was like some top secret report. I just wanted to see it. And I was expecting one page that was really half a page of information, name, address, and a couple of student loans. That's all that should have been there. And about 6 weeks later, this large manila envelope arrived in the mail from the credit reporting agency. And it was a really thick envelope. It was probably half an inch or so thick. And I thought credit reports must be really hard to read, and they must come with a lot of instructions and disclosures because there's no way my credit report is that thick. And when I got in my apartment, I opened the envelope and realized very quickly that credit reports are not difficult to read. They don't come with a lot of instructions and disclosures, but rather mine was 10 pages long, full of fraudulent credit card entries and collection agency entries that dated back to the time that my parents' identities were stolen in 1993. So by this point, it was 2001. My credit score was 380. And at that time, again, this is how naive I was at 19. I thought, well, 380 is almost 400. And 400, well, that's almost four times as perfect because 100 is a perfect score in school on assignment. So, like, I'm four times as perfect, right? And there was a little bell curve under the uh, sentence, your credit score is 380, that was in bold, and with a little asterisk by it that said, your credit score is in the second percentile of all credit scores in the nation. So, of course, my credit score was far from perfect, and the identity thief had used my credit until they couldn't use it anymore. So, um, again, back at that time, college students were inundated with credit card offers. I didn't get my first one until I was 23, and I'll get into that on the next slide. Again, as I mentioned earlier, multiple family members' identities were stolen. So, yeah, I mentioned that mom said that her identity and my father's identity were stolen. My identity was stolen. And um, we found out as part of this whole process over 20 years that my step grandfather's identity was stolen as well. And he lived with us for a number of years. So, my first car loan, I obtained a car loan when I was 23 on a 5-year-old used car. I'd had a credit card in my name for a month at that point, and that's the second bullet point there. The credit card with a 29.99% APR that had a $69 annual fee, which they assessed before they would send me the credit card, that only had a $300 limit. And I ended up getting a car loan because the old clunker I drove in college just wasn't worth fixing. And with my mom co-signing for me, my APR on that loan was 18.23%. That's like putting a used car on a credit card. Now, after 6 months of perfect payments, I was able to refinance and get the interest rate cut down in half. But still, that's a steep price to pay for something that I didn't do. And, that's one of the common feelings that victims of identity theft have. It's like, why am I being treated like the criminal? I didn't do anything wrong. Why am I being looked at like I'm financially irresponsible? It wasn't me. Why do I have to pay all these extra charges when it wasn't me? I had to pay deposits for utility services, so not just the electric company, telephone company. Um, the first time I applied for cable TV service, I had to pay a security deposit for that. I also paid higher auto insurance rates through 2009 because my credit report would not fully clear of fraudulent entries until 2009. And your auto insurance rates are in part based on your credit score. So again, there's an extra charge that I'm being charged for that, you know, I didn't do this. I'm not financially irresponsible, but yet it looks like I am, but I'm not. And the insurance companies don't care. And then with regard to emotions, um, identity theft for me was very isolating because, again, in the 90s, nobody knew what it was. And even in the early 2000s, when I was in college, there weren't a lot of resources for victims. So, again, remember, consumers weren't viewed as victims until 1998. I found out I was a victim of identity theft in 2001. The only resource out there that I could find at that time dedicated to victims was the Identity Theft Resource Center in San Diego, which they're still in existence. And by the way, they are incredibly helpful. Um, I ended up going to law enforcement and filing a report, but there wasn't a lot of action there, which is pretty typical in cases of identity theft. Um, the isolation, also growing up um, kind of under the shadow of my parents' identity theft, was that because we didn't know who was responsible for the identity theft, but we knew it was someone close to us, we just withdrew from relationships. So extended family members, we didn't talk to them. Friends of the family, we didn't talk to them. Um, you know, our phone was shut off because of utilities fraud related to the identity theft. So, there was no calling out. Growing up, there was no calling your friends. There was no like calling friends and saying, "Hey, let's hang out," or "Let's go to the movie theater," or, whatever. Um, my pen pal letters. So again, I'm old. When I was growing up, you hand wrote letters to your friends, and um, our mail was being stolen as part of the identity theft. So I didn't get those letters either. And then, as kids tend to do, they get mad when, they think that one friend isn't responding to them and has, dropped them as a friend or is ignoring them. And I wasn't ignoring them. I wasn't getting their letters. So those were being stolen out of our mail. At least that's what my mom had been telling me. I was taught not to trust. I have on the slide here, plumber example. My step grandfather lived in a house next to us on our farm, and uh, he hired a plumber, but didn't tell anybody. And so when this plumber showed up and walked through our gate and started going back towards our barn, um, I ran out of the house with a butcher knife and chased him off because, again, he wasn't supposed to be there. And even though he had his hands up and he's telling me, I'm the plumber, and, he said, my step grandfather had hired him, I didn't believe him because, again, everybody was potentially a suspect. You couldn't trust anybody. You couldn't take anyone at their word. That was what was drilled into me growing up. And then again, being hyper vigilant, because with identity theft, and if any of you are victims, there's always something that comes up. It could be a collection agency notice. It could be a utility shut off for non-payment on an account that you don't have. It could just be, a collection agency suing you, and you come home and you find that notification. There's always something that pops up, so you're always waiting for that. And I really felt that growing up, and I felt that into young adulthood as well. In my case, there was polyvictimization. Polyvictimization simply means that multiple types of abuse were experienced by a victim. And as you'll see from the other stories I share from my research, this is actually pretty common where there's financial abuse, which I consider identity theft in the context of family relationships to be a form of financial abuse. So in addition to financial abuse, there's often emotional abuse co-occurring. There could be physical abuse, there could be sexual abuse, there could be neglect. It's very rare, at least from the data that I've been able to collect, that identity theft within the family system happens in isolation. There's usually at least one other form of abuse going on. In my case, I will share a little bit of information about the perpetrator. So her educational background was finance. So, the perpetrator in my case had the knowledge to know what boundaries she could push with identity theft and with some of the other financial abuse that she was engaged in. So instead of using her knowledge to help people, she actually used it to benefit herself while in the process of hurting her family members. She worked in the financial services industry, and there were some pretty clear indications of a personality disorder after it was discovered she was the offender. And of course, I didn't discover who the offender was until after she passed away. So there was no holding her accountable through the court system or confronting her. It was all like, well, I have to make sense of this. And I have to do that by looking at documents and talking to her former friends and extended family that I hadn't seen or spoken to in at least 20 years, and putting the pieces together. And, through those conversations and through looking at documentation, there are some pretty strong indications that there was a personality disorder, which is actually really common in the data that I've been able to collect.
Axton, can I interrupt you for a question that came through?
Sure.
So the question is, what do you think about the new federal law that went into effect September 21st of 2018? It seems pretty late. That lets parents / child welfare representatives / legal guardians of people under 16 request a credit freeze. I feel that it should be an automatic thing where all minors under 18 are protected. Should credit freezes be used?
So credit freezes should be used. The flaw to me in that is that, if a parent, if it's a parent or legal guardian's responsibility, which it is under that law, a parent who's going to steal their child's identity, they're not going to freeze their child's credit. So, with stopping parents from stealing their children's identities, I think we need to look more at what's causing the parents to do this. What's going on in the environment, what's going on with them psychologically, to really understand what's happening to develop more effective interventions. And I think that's probably going to come more out of the psychology area than perhaps what we do in financial counseling and planning. But with that said, I do think it's a useful tool. My guess is why it didn't go all the way up to 18 with that law is because there are parents out there who want to help their children establish credit by being, say, a co-signer on their first car loan, and they don't, want that ability to be a co-signer and help their child establish positive credit be stopped because of a certain piece of legislation. So another drawback to credit freezes is that it does nothing to stop existing account fraud. All credit freezes do are stop new account creation, meaning, like in my case, when credit cards were taken out in my name, if the credit freeze law had been in effect and someone had placed a credit freeze on my file, when I was 11 years old, those credit cards couldn't have been established. But let's say, I had a checking account and someone gained access to that credit freeze does nothing to stop existing account fraud. Does that help? If you have follow-up questions, please put them in the chat. So the next story I'll share with you, this is from one of my research participants. This is from a study that I published back in 2020. And this particular victim, she had her identity stolen by her father at the age of 6 to establish a fraudulent business and avoid paying taxes. And so in my case, which I didn't share in detail, there was some tax evasion going on using my identity as well by the perpetrator. And I'm seeing that this is actually a fairly common pattern with offenders. And in Scarlett's case, there was poly-victimization as well because her father not only stole her identity, but also sold her into human trafficking. So she was a victim of sexual abuse as well. She was able to escape that, but she spent her high school years homeless. So she did go to school, this is amazing. She lived in a cave. She lived in a cave, foraged for a period of time for food. Somehow was connected with a homeless youth program that helped her obtain her credit report, start to repair the damage from the identity theft, and help her get resources. Now she's successful and has a master's degree and is working in the healthcare field. So it's a really incredible story of overcoming adversity in this particular victim's case. But, she definitely had some emotional consequences where, she feels fear of, okay, what could happen next? That happened in my past. Could it happen again? Could somebody that was involved in the human trafficking, could they find me? Could they get my personal information again? She works in the healthcare field and she works with a lot of parents who bring children in for services. And because of her experience, she doesn't automatically trust what the parents are saying about what's going on with their child. She automatically distrusts children, just like I automatically distrusted the plumber who came to our farm to do work. She distrusts parents automatically. And she also distrusts government agencies because she had a very difficult time in dealing with the IRS to address the back taxes issue that was created by her father using her identity for the fraudulent business. And she has empathy for her current clients that express concern about being potential victims of medical identity theft. Moving on to Darwin's story, his identity was stolen at either age 23 or 24 by his father to establish utilities and obtain a mortgage. In his family, multiple family members' identities were stolen. So his brother and his mother, in addition to him, and there was a lot of marital discord. In fact, his father actually stayed married to his mother, but went off and had a second family. And this was known, and the mom just, for whatever reason, chose to accept it and not address it. And that caused a lot of emotional issues for Darwin and his siblings. In addition to the emotional consequences from the identity theft. So Darwin expressed mistrust of financial institution employees. So he talked about when financial institution employees would ask for personal information to verify his identity, he didn't fully trust that, because what he said to me was, what keeps that employee from writing down my personal information or just remembering it and then using it to steal my identity? He also expressed that there were limited resources in his rural location to assist identity theft victims. So moving on to Sassy's story, her father stole her identity at age 11 to obtain student loans. Her father was concerned with how others perceived the family, and as a result, Sassy rejected this as an adult. She realized that, how people perceive you in terms of, what you own and what you wear, it's really not a reflection of who you are as a person. And her father tried to project an image and finance an image that he really couldn't afford. And how he afforded it was through stealing the identities of his children. She expressed moving to a rural area made it easier for members of the family to keep things hidden from others. And interestingly, her father actually had a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. So in a few of these cases where I've been able to interview victims, some of the perpetrators have been evaluated by a mental health professional, and they've been diagnosed with different personality disorders, including narcissistic personality disorder. So Sonny's story, his identity was stolen by his mother while he was away at college. And what happened was he left a checkbook at home, thinking that it would be safe at home while he's living in the dorm at college. And his mom started writing checks off of the account and just started using the account as her own and emptied it. And there was concurrent emotional and physical abuse. There was actually some extreme physical abuse that Sonny experienced at the hands of his mother. And the outcome from Sonny's experience is that he's underemployed. He just has so many emotional challenges and financial challenges related to the identity theft and the other forms of abuse that he experienced, that it's difficult for him to function. And he knows that he should be doing better. He expressed that to me. He knows that he has the education and the ability to do better, but the emotions and trying to deal with that, it really at this point in his life is holding him back.
Axton, this is Sarah. I'm going to break
Yeah.
in here. One of the participants sent me a question, and she said that she and her siblings were victims of identity theft in college by a stepmother. Additional student loans were taken out in their names, 2 credit cards. They didn't know about that until years later. Some bills were paid by herself and siblings, some by the stepmom. But she wants to know, and I'm guessing you're going to get into this, what can she do to help help make sure that her youngest brother doesn't experience this when he starts college?
So the number one thing to do is to have the younger brother obtain his credit report now using annualcreditreport.com. And annualcreditreport.com is the only website that is available where anybody from the public can go and get a free copy of their credit report from each of the three credit bureaus once a year. And if you check it, it won't hurt your credit score at all. That's a that's a myth that's out there. But when he does that, he can look to see what may have already been established in his name fraudulently, and then he can dispute that. And then also put a credit freeze on. Put a credit freeze on now, assuming that he's 18. I've just made a huge assumption there, but if he's 18, he can freeze his credit now, even though he may or may not be a victim of identity theft. That doesn't matter anymore. So anybody can freeze their credit, and that'll stop any new account creation. So what can we learn from these stories? So if a family member is the perpetrator, other concurrent forms of abuse are likely. So again, that idea of polyvictimization. Emotional impacts may be more salient than financial impacts. When I talk with victims, oftentimes they'll talk to me about the emotional impacts and how much that has had a negative influence on their life, more so than the financial. And coming from a financial counseling and planning background, that's really interesting to me because we're trained as financial counselors and planners. Let's work on addressing the financial concerns. Victims often have greater emotional concerns, which often need referred out to a mental health professional. And then also victims may have a threat of resilience. There may be things in their life, supportive relationships, just their personality of having the desire to overcome, that as a professional, you can help the client build upon that to propel them through the process of recovering from identity theft. So family member perpetrators often steal multiple family members' identities. It's usually not just, say, one child. If there are multiple children in the family, likely multiple children have their identity stolen. The spouse may have their identity stolen as well. Perpetrators may socially isolate their victims, and rural communities may provide the setting that perpetrators need to facilitate identity theft due to limited victim resources, and then just the isolation that can occur in a rural community just from being spread out and being farther apart from other people.
I have another question.
Sure.
How would we protect ourselves from government agency employees stealing our identity? My parent didn't trust government agencies after learning that one of my siblings' identities was stolen. They found out that their social security number was used to let someone be employed. So they report the case worker because there's only one person in the agency that was handling the case file, but my sibling's identity was already stolen when they were 6 years old.
So to address that, you'll want to go to the Social Security Administration because if the victim's identity was used to obtain employment, that Social Security number is now tied to employment, which is being reported to the Social Security Administration. So those earnings are being reported to the Social Security Administration. They're the ones who really are in the best position to correct that. But I'm not going to lie, they are a difficult entity to work with because this is so widespread and there is so much Social Security fraud. But the Social Security Administration are really the folks that you want to work with. And if they are not helpful, I would reach out to the Identity Theft Resource Center in San Diego. So protecting children from victimization, just some quick things like easy peasy things that you can do. Don't provide a child's personal information to those who have no need for it. I remember several years ago, there was a story that made national news where a Girl Scout troop leader was taking her troop on a trip, and she requested that the parents fill out a form with the child's name and, like their allergies and um, parents' names and also their social security number. Um, and what ended up happening is, the parents dutifully filled it out. They trusted the troop leader, and then the troop leader used the information she received to steal the identities of all of her troop members. So, if the individual or entity doesn't need the information, don't give it to them. If you're not sure, ask why they need it and what they're going to do with it and how they're going to secure that information. If they don't have satisfactory answers, then don't give them the information. Keep things like date of birth and mother's maiden name off of social media, because those are two pieces of information that an identity thief can use to steal a child's identity. We've talked about credit freezes for children, and then enhanced protections for children who are victims of abuse. And I'm actually conducting a study now with victims of identity theft who had their identity stolen by a parent, and most of these individuals experienced polyvictimization, whether it was emotional abuse, physical abuse, or some other type of abuse. And most of them are saying when, Child Protective Services or law enforcement became aware of what was happening to me, they focused on whatever the other type of abuse was, but no one bothered to think about my credit report. No one bothered to think about, well, identity theft could be happening as well. So, when there are cases of physical abuse or sexual abuse or emotional abuse or neglect, we need to take it a step farther. And in some contexts, we're doing this where we're pulling a child's credit report and looking to see, are they a victim of identity theft? And this is common now in working with foster care youth, but it's not 100% across the board yet. So again, polyvictimization, it's really common with victims of child identity theft. But again, we don't think about that. We think about the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, the neglect. But we don't think about that likely co-occurring financial piece. And then moving on to detecting child identity theft. If you are concerned that child identity theft may be happening to a child living in your home or one that some kind of red flags to look out for are receiving pre-approved credit offers in the child's name. The only way for that to happen is if the child already has a credit file with one of the 3 credit reporting agencies, which likely means that credit has been taken out in their name while they're underage. Correspondence from collection agencies addressed to the child, you might be inclined to think, oh, that's just a mistake. It's likely not a mistake. It's likely tied to identity theft. You can do a minor credit check with the credit reporting agencies. Each credit reporting agency, Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, have their own process for how to request these. And you'll have to request a minor credit check as a parent or guardian, or I guess if you're a caseworker, you request it that way as well. And you'll have to provide documentation, of your relationship to the child, probably the child's social security number, your driver's license, things of that nature. And if there's no credit file found by the credit reporting agencies, that's good. That means that there's been no credit established in your child's name. So I want to put that out there because sometimes folks think, well, nothing was found. Is that a bad thing? It's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing. If there is a file in a child's name and uh, there shouldn't be, meaning that no one's co-signing for a car loan with that child or anything like that, then you can start the process of working to clear the credit report of fraudulent information. So helping identity theft victims, here I'm going to talk more to professionals than parents or guardians. But with helping child identity theft victims, the most important rule, as we say in financial counseling and planning, is to stay in your lane, meaning know your scope of practice. So your credentialing and or licensing body has information that defines your professional scope of practice. So if you're a financial planner, you have to stay within the scope of financial planning. If you're a financial counselor, you have to stay in the scope of financial counseling. If you're a mental health provider, you have to stay within that scope. You can't be a financial counselor and go, well, I know some about mental health and treatment modalities. I can do that too. You got to stay within your scope of practice. So questions to ask yourself as a professional. First, who is your client? Is the victim 18 years old or older? If not, the parent or guardian is likely your client. Are there other forms of abuse co-occurring? And if so, are you a mandated reporter? For financial counseling and planning professionals, that varies from state to state. Some states say, yes, as a financial counselor or planner, if you suspect any form of abuse, you have to report it. Some states say that you do not. But if you're a mental health professional, you are a mandated reporter. If you're a classroom teacher and you suspect that there might be financial abuse or neglect or physical, emotional, or sexual abuse of a child, you're a mandated reporter. So again, it depends on your profession. It also depends on your state laws. So steps that need to be taken: file a complaint with law enforcement. This is usually the biggest stumbling block if the perpetrator is a family member, because again, victims don't want to get a family member in trouble. They may be dependent on that family member for financial resources or caregiving resources. They don't want to cause conflict within the family, or maybe they don't want to exacerbate conflict that's already there. And then I mentioned before, annualcreditreport.com. It is the only site that will give you free access to your credit report from each of the 3 credit bureaus. And again, those are Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. Consider a credit freeze. Again, that only stops new credit accounts from being opened in your name, not fraudulent activity on existing accounts. Dispute fraudulent accounts with the credit bureaus and original creditors, and you'll likely need to send evidence like a police report. I mentioned before, obtain your Social Security earnings statement from the Social Security Administration. You can do this through ssa.gov and set up a myssa.gov account. This report can indicate if your identity is being used for employment fraud. So my identity was stolen in 1993 when I was 11. If I were to look at my Social Security earnings statement, and in 1993, if it said I made $30,000, I know that that's probably related to identity theft because I was 11 years old. I couldn't work and make $30,000 in 1993 unless I was working full time. So your Social Security earnings statement will show you, the amount of credits that have been earned towards your retirement earnings and disability earnings that you qualify for. And if there are years where it seems like, hey, there's way too much here with earnings, particularly with children, that is an indicator that their identity has been used for employment fraud. And then a note about emotional effects. And again, with this slide, I'm talking more to professionals than parents or guardians. But the victim or client is likely going to present with a range of different emotions as they navigate the recovery process, like frustration. Frustration is very common. Anger that this happened, anger at financial institutions, anger at family members, just angry. Feeling unsupported, particularly by other family members. And family bonds are frequently broken as a result of child identity theft. Embarrassment, embarrassed that this happened to them, embarrassed that their family member did this to them, feeling like they're the only person that this could ever happen to, and being embarrassed by that. And then feeling like no one understands his or her situation. Again, going back to that idea of this never happens to anyone. No one's going to understand. And they feel embarrassed and they shut down and they may not want to talk, or they may confide in you as a trusted professional. But again, what they're confiding in you may be beyond the scope of your practice, and a referral to a mental health professional may be necessary. And then I will open it up
Perfect.
for
Yeah.
questions.
We have a couple questions, Axton. One is, what should we be asking about secure storage? And I asked for some clarification on that. And Jen responded, I was thinking about when you have to complete forms with sensitive personal information, what kinds of questions should they be asking about, data privacy sorts of things? What, when you're filling out paperwork at the doctor's office or other places?
Yeah, so great question. So ask how the information is going to be stored and who has access to it. Because, the HIPAA policies and all those things, those are great. They're needed. But if the paper goes into a file cabinet that isn't secured, well, then there's no protection. So you want to ask just basic questions like that. Who has access to the information? How and where is it going to be stored?
Great, thanks. Another question related to credit reports. So if your identity is stolen, or if your credit report is stolen, you can request it more than once a year to make sure everything stays frozen. So if your identity is frozen, how often, excuse me, if your identity is stolen, how often can you request that credit report?
Oh gosh. I know as of, I'd have to check for the most current information, but the laws on this changed during COVID, and I know through the end of 2022 you could request it weekly. That may have been rolled back for this year. I'll have to double check on that. I don't want to say the wrong thing.
Well, we can definitely check that one out, and we will be sending a follow-up email with a PDF of the PowerPoint slides, so we can find that information as well.
Mhm.
Other questions? Well, we will give folks time to add more questions to the chat if you're interested, and I'm going to do a few wrap-up slides, Axton, if that's all right.
Okay.
Perfect, perfect. So we invite everyone to complete an evaluation. That is extremely helpful to us as we plan future webinars. There's a question there about future topics and all of that. Also, if you would like a certificate of participation, there is a question in the evaluation, and you'll have to provide some information so that a certificate can be emailed to you. If you are a University of Minnesota employee or spouse who is on the insurance, and if you're looking for those well-being points, also please complete that evaluation and follow the link to request those points. And please note that those points are added monthly, and so be patient on that piece. We are in the midst of our May through August webinars, 9 series, 31 webinars. Go ahead and take a look at those. We encourage you to check out the other topics and participate in those webinars. We also invite you to engage with our University of Minnesota Extension Center for Family Development. We just changed our name to the Department for Family Health and Wellbeing, and I didn't catch that on the slide, but definitely engage with us. We invite you to do that. Yes, thank you, Rose. She put the evaluation link in the chat there. Great. Any final questions? Thank you, Mina. I appreciate it. Well, we will hang out for a few more minutes. If folks have questions, we will be here, but thank you everyone for participating. And a huge thank you, Axton, for joining us from across the border in South Dakota. Go Jacks. I love SDSU almost as much as I love U of M. So thanks for being with us today. Which webinar series is this in? It is, I believe, in the Making Sense of It All series. So one of the questions on the eval is which webinar series. So I think we are in the Making Sense of It All.